I'm pleased to join the 40th year anniversary of the Marine Environmental Law program at Dalhousie University. My name is David VanderZwaag, Professor of Law and Canada Research Chair in Ocean Law and Governance. My association with the Marine Environmental Law program goes back many years. I originally joined the program in the early 1980s as a Master of Law student under the supervision of Douglas M. Johnston. Subsequently joined the faculty in about 1985 and have taught many courses over the years, including environmental law, tort law, law of the sea, and presently international environmental law. Today, I have a very short presentation on the 2013 Minamata Convention on Mercury. Will it protect the Arctic environment? By way of introduction, the Minamata Convention on Mercury was adopted in October 2013 at a diplomatic conference in Japan. It followed 5 negotiating sessions in the years 2010 to 2013 by the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee. The convention, of course, draws its name from the famous city of Minamata in Japan, where methyl mercury was discharged from a chemical factory over quite a few years, causing serious nervous disorder and diseases to local inhabitants along a local river. Problem officially acknowledged in 1956, and ailment named by scientists as Minamata disease in 1957. The convention then is a global agreement spurred by the multiple sources of mercury pollution and long-range mercury transports around the globe. And actually, the United Nations Environment Program issued a major report on mercury in 2013. The total human emissions of mercury to the atmosphere in 2010 are estimated to be about 1,960 tons. With some uncertainty, it may actually be greater than that, up to around over 4,000 tons. Interestingly, Asia is considered the major source region, if you will. East and Southeast Asia accounting for about 40% of the global total emissions, and South Asia for a further 8%. This is critical because you see that the Mercury Convention really was essential to deal with the global long-range transport of pollutants, including mercury. Numerous sectoral sources of mercury emissions, artisanal and small-scale gold mining contributing about 37% of the global total. Coal burning, responsible for about 474 tons, or 24% of the total emissions globally. Mining and smelting of non-ferrous metals, aluminum, copper, lead, zinc, 10% of the global emissions, and cement production, another 9%. And then there are various other sources as well. When you cremate bodies in certain countries, particularly like in Thailand, again, mercury fillings may go up and be emitted from the emissions from the mercury in the fillings into the atmosphere. And oil refining as well has some minor contributions to mercury in the atmosphere. Mercury emissions from China estimated to be at least 4 times greater than from any other country. And again, this is a graph from the Arctic Council study a few years ago, where you see China, way above the closest other country, being India, United States, Russia, and all the way up to close to 800 tons of emissions to the air from various sources. So China is clearly a country that has to really control the mercury, perhaps more than any other country, given its large contribution to the global emissions. Total human releases of mercury into water in 2010 believed to be about 1,000 tons at a minimum, with the 3 largest sources being, again, small-scale gold mining, deforestation, and industrial sites. Negotiation of the convention was substantially driven by the Arctic environmental and health concerns. Considerable amounts of mercury enter the Arctic every year. About 100 tons of mercury are estimated to enter the Arctic Ocean from the air every year. Nearly another 100 tons thought to inflow from the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, rivers, and coastal erosion. And there's growing concerns over the possible impacts of course, mercury on marine life and human well-being as well. There's also a growing concern, actually, of mercury and what it may do in terms of climate change. With melting ice, mercury that's kind of frozen, if you will, in the ice will actually get emitted, and there's worries about the higher levels of mercury going out into the environment. there's great concerns about the higher level marine mammals. Higher trophic level animals have shown overall a tenfold increase over the past 150 years of their body burdens of mercury. Some top marine predators, such as toothed whales and polar bears, have exhibited mercury levels in their tissues and organs believed to exceed thresholds for biological effects. Considerable uncertainty yet about the effects of mercury because of, again, the other stressors like persistent organic pollutants, chemicals, and of course the effects of climate change. Human health risks, again, are a major and continuing concern. Over 90% of women of childbearing age in some parts of Greenland still have a blood mercury concentration above guideline safe levels. In Nunavut, in Canada, one of our territories, a study has found that 59% of children surveyed had a methyl mercury intake that exceeded the acceptable level for children. The Mercury Convention's preamble actually emphasizes the special need to address mercury in the Arctic, noting the particular vulnerabilities of Arctic ecosystems and indigenous communities because of the biomagnification of mercury and contamination of traditional foods. The extent to which this new convention will curb the transport of mercury into the Arctic environment really remains to be seen. And two images, very quickly I will go through, help, I think, fix where we are in dealing with mercury under the convention. One is mercurial promises. The convention offers many rays of hope with some dimmings with it, but really quite promising aspects. And then mercurial challenges. The convention abounds in implementation hurdles. And I'll get into 7 of those a bit later. So very quickly, 10 promising beams, you might say, shine forth from the convention. First of all, is phasing out primary mercury mining. No new mercury mines will be allowed for a party to the convention after entering into force of the convention for it. Mining conducted within a party's territory at the date of entry into the force of the convention overall must be phased out within that party within 15 years. So it's a phase out of mercury. A second aspect of promise is limited trade in mercury. The convention prohibits exports of mercury except when an importing party or non-party has given its written consent. This is the prior informed consent procedure we see in the hazardous waste field under the Basel Convention. They now brought it in under the Mercury Convention as well. Export to a party may only occur for a use allowed to the importing party under the convention or for environmentally sound interim storage of mercury. Export to a non-party would have the same restrictions with an additional requirement that the non-party must certify as measures in place which ensure the protection of human health and the environment. A third promising aspect is phasing out the manufacture, import, or export of mercury-added products listed under Annex 8, Part 1 of the Convention. And they set a phase-out date then for these various products by 2020. And I give you a list of the examples. Most of your batteries that contain mercury will have to be phased out. Batteries except for certain button cell batteries with a mercury content less than 2%. Mercury within switches and relays, again, phased out by 2020. Some fluorescent lamps, cosmetics and soaps with mercury in them, again, have to be phased out by 2020. Pesticides, biocides, and antiseptics containing mercury. Non-electric measuring devices, including barometers, thermometers, etc. It should be interesting, again, to many to note that there are exceptions. Various products are excluded from the phase-out, including products essential for civil protection and military uses, products used in traditional or religious practices. Convention doesn't list those, so it's open to interpretation. And perhaps most importantly, vaccines containing thiomersal as a preservative. In fact, mercury is used as preservative in many vaccines, and again, this helps many developing countries without refrigeration to have adequate access to vaccines, so they had this important exception put under the convention. Fourth aspect of promise is phasing down the use of dental amalgam. Each party is required to take 2 or more measures from quite a long list of measures set on Annex A, Part 2, to phase down the use of dental amalgam, mercury in your cavity fillings. Those measures include, among others, setting national objectives for cavity prevention and health promotion, thereby minimizing the need for dental fillings, promoting the use of mercury-free alternatives to dental restoration, promoting research and development of mercury-free fillings, restricting the use of dental amalgam, and promoting the use of best environmental practices in dental facilities to reduce mercury releases. For example, maybe having a filter at the dentist's office to make sure the mercury doesn't go out into the waste treatment system if it's in a municipality, for example. A fifth promising aspect is prohibiting the use of mercury in listed manufacturing processes under Annex B, Part 1. So chloralkali production facilities have to phase out the use of mercury by 2025. Acetaldehyde production by 2018. And then the sixth kind of promising aspect, there's called for restriction of the use of mercury in manufacturing process listed in Annex B, Part 2. I'll give you just two quick examples of their, what's listed. Vinyl chloride, again, used to make a form of plastic. That production with restrictive measures must include reduction in the use of mercury in terms of per unit of production by 50% by the year 2020 against 2010 use, not allowing the use of mercury 5 years after the Conference of the Parties has established that mercury-free processes have become technically and economically feasible. This provision was really negotiated by China because they knew that they rely very much on mercury in their vinyl chloride industry, and they wanted some time to make sure that they wouldn't have to phase out too quickly. Another restricted industrial process is polyurethane production, and the measures include reduction in mercury use aiming at a phase out as fast as possible within 10 years of the convention's entry into force, encouragement of research and development respecting mercury-free catalysts. So under the sixth category, you don't have actual prohibition, but basically trying to phase out the use of mercury in a number of these industrial processes. The seventh promising aspect is calling for national actions to reduce and, where feasible, to eliminate the use of mercury and release of mercury from artisanal and small-scale gold mining under Article 7. Under this provision, each country that has more than insignificant small-scale gold mining is required to come up with a national action plan. And Annex C of the Convention sets out a list of elements that national action plans should include: national objectives and reduction targets, eliminating the open burning of amalgam, strategies for reducing emissions and releases of mercury, public health strategies to make sure that vulnerable communities may actually have health care and maybe monitoring of their health that may be involved in the gold mining. And considerable flexibility, however, is allowed to when national action plans must be submitted to the Secretariat no later than 3 years after entering into force of the Convention for a party, or 3 years after a party notifies the Secretariat of more than insignificant mining processes in its territory, whichever is later. And the Convention does not define insignificant, so a lot of discretion is going to be left to countries whether they develop national action plans or not. Even without a national action plan, parties are required to reduce and, where feasible, to eliminate use of mercury in small-scale gold mining and processing, and emissions and release of mercury into the environment from such sources, again, should be reduced as much as possible. An eighth promising aspect is calling for parties to control and, where feasible, to reduce mercury emissions to the atmosphere from 5 source categories listed in Annex D under Article 8. And the 5-point sources are your big emitters that we all know about, or should know about: coal-fired power plants, coal-fired industrial boilers, smelting of non-ferrous metals, lead, zinc, copper, and industrial gold, waste incineration facilities, and cement clinker production facilities. So cement facilities. For new sources, each party is required to use best available techniques and best environmental practices as soon as practicable, but no later than 5 years after date of entry into force of the Convention for the party. For existing sources, those that are already in operation, by the time the Convention comes into force, each party must implement one or more of the listed measures as soon as practicable, but no more than 10 years after entering into force of the Convention for it. And such measures include, again, a long list: establishing a quantified goal for controlling and, where feasible, reducing emissions from relevant sources, setting mercury emission limit values, requiring the use of best available techniques and best environmental practices. A ninth promising aspect is requiring parties to control and, where feasible, to reduce mercury releases to land or water, with one or more of listed measures to be taken, such as, again, setting mercury release limit values, mandating the use of best available techniques and best available environmental practices. And finally, number 10, I'll give you kind of a top 10 list today of the promises, encouraging international cooperation in mercury-related research and monitoring under Article 19. The convention calls for improved monitoring of mercury levels in vulnerable populations, our human populations, and in biotic media such as fish, marine mammals, sea turtles, and birds. And research on technical and economic availability of mercury-free products and processes is also encouraged. So we're going to be looking for alternatives to mercury in a globally kind of coordinated kind of way under the convention. So those then are the major promises. Let's move quickly then to 7 major challenges, what I call mercurial challenges. First of all, it's reaching what I call rigorous ratification of the convention. Convention requires 50 ratifications, acceptances for entry into force under Article 31. As of today, when I'm speaking to you, May 1, 2015, there were 128 signatories, but only 11 ratifications. So we have a long ways to go. And just as an aside, interestingly, the U.S. was the first acceptor of the convention, the formal adopter of the convention. It did it by executive agreement. And so, again, everyone knows about the problems of U.S. Congress, the U.S. Senate, where you have to go and get kind of a ratification of conventions, of treaties. So the Obama administration avoided going to the Senate by really going through an executive agreement kind of format. Second challenge is ensuring timely phase-outs. The convention allows parties to register for exemptions from the phase-out dates for mercury-added products and manufacturing processes for mercury. Initial exemptions may be for 5 years after the relevant phase-out dates listed in Annex A or B. Parties may require further 5-year extensions through a decision of the Conference of the Parties. So you have these long possibilities of phase-outs. A third kind of challenge is achieving reductions in mercury air emissions and land and water releases. Considerable flexibility is left to parties in addressing emissions and releases. For air emissions, this is critical. No overall obligation is there under the convention to reduce emissions, but only to control emissions. That's fundamental, because countries might in fact control, but increase, let's say, the number of coal-fired plants and increase their actual overall emissions. So that's a fundamental weakness challenge under the convention. For the 5 point sources of mercury emissions covered by the convention, I mentioned before, coal-fired plants, non-ferrous metal smelting, waste incinerators, cement production facilities. Not clear all such sources will be subject to controls either. Parties may establish their own criteria, for example, megawatt capacity or tonnage of waste incinerated per hour or day to identify covered sources, so long as any category includes at least 75% of the emissions from that category. Guidance for setting thresholds for point sources are to be developed, basically developed by the Conference of the Parties as soon as practicable. So we'll get further guidance on this later once the convention enters into force. For new sources, application of best available techniques and best environmental practices will be required, but guidance on BAT and BEP is left to the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties, so we don't have that guidance yet. And emission reduction will only be required when feasible. So again, flexibility there. For existing sources of mercury emissions from these 5 sources, each party is required to take at least one control measure, but again, there's substantial discretion allowed in implementation, as a party may take into account its national circumstances and the economic and technical feasibility and affordability of the measures. So again, this brings in the whole social economic factors that may come into play, where a country may be very slow to reduce emissions and may actually lag in control of emissions. For land and water releases, each party must identify relevant point source categories of mercury releases within 3 years after entering force of the convention for it, and only measures control releases, not reduction, is required. So again, even for emissions, let's say, to a river, again, it's control, not reduction, that's actually required. A fourth challenge is protecting human health. The convention may be viewed as progressive, at least it addresses human health in Article 16. However, the convention merely encourages encourages various efforts to deal with health issues. For example, parties are encouraged to promote development and implementation of strategies and programs to identify and protect populations at risk, especially vulnerable populations, and science-based education preventive programs on mercury occupational exposures are encouraged. And again, countries are encouraged to put in place healthcare services for affected populations. A fifth challenge is ensuring adequate financing for capacity building and technology transfer. To support developing countries and economies in transition, implementing the convention, a two-pronged financial mechanism is mandated through Article 13 of the Minamata Convention. The Global Environment Facility Trust Fund and a specific international funding program, so two prongs. How effective the financing will be remains to be seen. Funding is to be on a voluntary basis, and again, you'll find this quite common under multilateral environmental agreements, perhaps with a few exceptions, particularly the Montreal Protocol on ozone-depleting substances, but here it's voluntary. The Conference of the Parties is required to work out the financial details, providing guidance to the GEF Trust Fund on priorities and eligibilities for financing, deciding on the hosting institution for the specific funding program, including its duration. A sixth challenge is ensuring implementation and compliance. The convention might be considered quite weak with its approach to compliance. Discretion is left to the parties as to whether a national implementation plan will be developed and whether such a plan will be transmitted to the Secretariat. Each party will be required to report to the Conference of the Parties on implementation measures and challenges with the Conference of the Party at its first meeting to decide upon the timing and format of reporting. So we're still not sure how often reporting will have to occur. The convention is progressive by establishing an Implementation Compliance Committee under Article 15, which will have, however, limited review powers. It will be very much facilitative in nature, not punitive in nature. It may review compliance through three main avenues: a written submission by any party as to its own compliance, national reports, requests from the Conference of the Parties. You'll note there's no provision for a non-governmental organization or a private citizen to come in and make some kind of complaint. Again, not unusual under multilateral environmental agreements. Finally, the final number 7 challenge is sorting out relationships with other conventions and international bodies. Clearly, the Minamata Convention does not swim alone. Coordination will have to occur with other international bodies in addressing aspects of mercury management, such as the World Health Organization, International Labor Organization, World Customs Organization. You have a global partnership on mercury under the United Nations Environment Program auspices. So there's a lot of coordination, cooperation that's going to have to occur down the line. One of the greatest challenges will likely be working out arrangements with multilateral agreements in the field of chemicals and waste. For example, should the Secretariat of the Minamata Convention be merged with the joint secretariat that we now have for the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, the Rotterdam Convention on a prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides in international trade, and the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. This is still being discussed and debated in the wake of the convention. Can capacity building for mercury management be piggybacked on existing or proposed training programs under the other conventions? How should the Minamata Convention relate to the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe Protocol to the 1979 Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution on heavy metals? We have a regional protocol on heavy metals which deals with lead, cadmium, but also mercury. Under that protocol, parties have already adopted a guidance document on best available techniques for controlling emissions of heavy metals, including mercury. And parties have already established a limit value for mercury emissions from waste incinerators of 0.05 milligram per cubic meters. So one thing to add in terms of this complexity as well, in terms of coordination, we now have a two-pronged financial mechanism that will be established under the convention. Well, back in June 2014, the UN Environment Assembly of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, just agreed to establish a whole new special funding program for chemicals and waste management, including the Minamata Convention. So we're now going to have to look at how we begin to pull together the various funding mechanisms and how they're going to coordinate, and that's another challenge down the road. So overall conclusions, I know I've spoken very fast, so I'll finish maybe a little slower. Will the Minamata Convention protect the Arctic environment? The Minamata Convention sets promising directions for addressing long-range transport of mercury into the Arctic, but its success in protecting the environment clearly is going to be open yet and depend very much on effective implementation. There have been some promising developments have occurred since the conclusion of the convention. In April of 2014, the Global Environment Facility, as part of its sixth replenishment funding, allocated US $141 million for mercury-related projects. The Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, which originally negotiated the convention, has come back and has new life. It held its sixth session in November 2014 in order to prepare for the convention's entry into force. It has facilitated the work of a special expert looking at best available technology, best environmental practices guidelines, and they're hoping to finalize a report by the Informal Negotiating Committee's seventh meeting, which should be in March 2016. Again, the INC has established an ad hoc working group of experts on financing, so we can expect more work to be done on coordinating the financing aspects under the convention. I guess the bottom line, and I'll stop here, is the convention is not a mercury god. It's going to take many, many years for countries to fully implement the convention, and it really remains to see how effective they will implement the convention, particularly countries in Asia, which are fundamental here. We have a lot of capacity development that's going to have to occur over the coming years. So clearly the convention must be viewed as a starting point, not an end point. Thank you.